Dear learners, in this unit, I am going to discuss about the fundamental rights in the federal system of governance. This is the very important units on these topics. And when we're talking about the fundamental rights in federal systems, that's are rights that are granted to the individuals by the constitutional or legal framework of a country for the protecting them against violations by the both federal and the state governments. These rights form the cornerstones of democratic governance and rare essentials for the maintaining individuals' freedoms and justice. Here, how fundamental rights typically functions in the federal systems. Constitutional protections. And in the constitutional protections, that is Bill of Rights or equivalents. In federal systems, fundamental rights are often inscribed in a constitution or a specific Bill of Rights. These documents outline the rights and freedoms that are granted to all the citizens, regardless of the state or region in which they live. For example, the US Bill of Rights protections rights such as freedoms of speech, religions, and due process. These are the important parts of the constitutional right. Next is that is uniformity to acts across the states. National standards. Fundamental rights are usually protected uniformly across all states or provinces, ensuring that all citizens enjoying the same basic freedoms regardless of where the residence. This unfortunately is crucial to in preventing the state from enacting law that would infringe on these rights. Next is preemptions by judicial or federal law. If a state law conflicts with the fundamental rights protected by the federal constitutions, federal law typically prevents the state law ensuring that right is upheld. These are the uniformity across the state. Next importance fundamental rights in the federal system, that is judicial review, role of the judiciary, courts, especially the Supreme or the constitutional courts, play a very key role in protecting fundamental rights by reviewing law and actions of both federal and state governments. Through judicial review, courts can strike down law that violate constitutional rights. This is very important parts of these things. A state courts, in addition to federal courts, a state courts may also interpret and protections fundamental rights, sometimes providing broader protections than those recognized by the federal courts. This is also important parts of the fundamental rights in the federal system of governance. Next is that each, when we talking about the incorporations doctrines, that is applications to the states. In many federal systems, the rights granted by the national constitutions are applied to the states through the doctrines of incorporations. This ensures that state governments are also bound by the same fundamental rights that the federal government must respect. In the US, the process has primarily occurred through the 14th Amendment. This is also very important part of the fundamental rights. Next is that is federalism and rigid diversity, a state specific rights. While fundamental rights are informally protected, a state may also recognize additional rights or provides greater protections than those granted at the federal level. For example, some states' constitutions include right not explicitly mentioned in the national constitutions, such as the right to privacy or environmental protections. Conflicts and harmonizations. Conflicts can also arise when a state law provides different level of protections for rights than federal law. Courts often have to harmonize these differences, ensuring that federal standards are met while respecting the state level nonsense. These are the very important things related to the fundamental rights. Now come to the balancing rights and state autonomy. When we're talking about these things, that each federal system often grapple with balancing the protections of fundamental rights with respect for a state autonomy. This can also lead to legal disputes, particularly when the state law or policy are perceived as infringing on the rights protected by the national constitutions. Next is that is civil rights and state rights. Historicals and ongoing debates in the federal systems often revolving around the tensions between the civil rights like the racial equality, voting rights, and state rights, with the federal governments sometimes stepping in to enforce right against resistance. These are the important rights that are mentioned in the federal system of government. Next is that is talking about the amendment process. This is also important parts related to the fundamental rights, that is protections and expanding rights. The process for amending the constitutions in a federal systems often require the involvement of both federals and state governments. This ensures that any changes to fundamental rights reflect a broader consciousness across different level of government. A state initiative, a state may also initiate amendments to the expense or clarify the protections of fundamental rights, which can then influence federal interpretations or lead to broader constitutional reform. That means key fundamental rights in the federal system of governments amendment process is also very important for the protections and expanding rights. And there is also a state initiative, and a state may also initiate amendments to extend for the clarifications, the protections of fundamental rights, which can then influence federal interpretations or lead to broader constitutional reforms. Next is that is minority rights protections, protections from Mediterraneanisms. Federal systems are often designated to protect minority rights from the potential tyranny of the majority. By dividing powers between federals and state governments, federals provides multiple layers of protections for minority groups and the cultural and regional side. In some federal systems, regions with distinct cultural and linguistic identity may have additional right to preserve their heritage and autonomy. These rights are often constitutionally protected to prevent their erosions by federal or other states level. This is also very important parts of the minority rights. Next is that is the rights related to emergency, that is limitations during the crisis. Fundamental rights in federal systems may be subject to be temporary limitations during the emergency, such as national security threats, or public health crisis. However, these limitations are usually subject to a strict legal scrutiny to prevent abuse. Judicial oversights. Courts typically play a crucial role in receiving and potentially overturning emergency measures that disproportionately infringing on the fundamental rights. These are the very important rights that have changing the nature, especially during the some kind of the crisis like the national security threats or the public health crisis. Next is that is called the international influences, that like the human rights norms. International human rights norms and treaty can influence the internationals and enforcements of fundamental rights. Within the federal systems, federal governments may incorporate international standards into the national law, which then apply across all states. This is very important things. Next is that is called the globalizations and the rights. A federal system engage more with global issues such as migrations and digital rights. There is increasing pressures to harmonize nationals' fundamental rights protections with the international human rights standards. This is very important influences, especially related to the rights and human right norms and globalizations and rights. These are also affecting in the federal system of governance. Here I am going to conclude that is fundamental rights in the federal system. Fundamental rights in the federal systems are central to maintaining the balance between the unity and diversity, ensuring that all citizens have equal protections under the law while allowing for regional differences. This interplay between the federal and state government in protecting these rights is a dynamic process shaped by ongoing legal, political, and social developments. These are the important comments on the fundamental rights in the federal system of governments. Thanks, thanks for hearing these lectures.